It was the summer of 1996, in a small town tucked deep in rural Ohio. A place where everyone knew each other's business and nothing ever really happened. The kind of town where the loudest noise at night came from the crickets and the occasional train rolling through in the distance. That summer, though, 3 teenagers, Mark, Lisa, and Darren, vanished, leaving behind one of the strangest mysteries the county had ever seen. They weren't troublemakers. They weren't the type to run away. They were just normal kids restless on a warm Friday night, chasing the thrill of doing something they weren't supposed to. The last place anyone saw them was near an old, rotting farmhouse on the outskirts of town. For decades, kids dared each other to go inside, whispering about strange lights in the windows and voices drifting through the fields after midnight. Most never made it past the front porch. But Mark, Lisa, and Darren weren't like most kids. They had a camcorder, flashlights, and a cheap toy recorder Lisa carried everywhere. A small, plastic voice, mimicking toy that would repeat anything you said in a distorted, funny pitch. They joked about using it to document their ghost hunt. The neighbors later said they saw the trio enter the farmhouse just before sunset. The place looked like it was holding itself together by stubborn nails. Peeling paint, broken windows, and a door that screeched when it opened. Nobody went in after them that night. By morning their bikes were still propped against the fence, the camcorder was gone, and the farmhouse sat quiet, as if nothing had happened. When their parents called the police, a search began almost immediately. Officers combed through the fields, dragged the nearby creek, and scoured the farmhouse room by room. The strangest discovery was in the basement. There, in the center of the cracked concrete floor, lay Lisa's toy recorder. The plastic was warped, half melted as if it had been exposed to fire. But there was no sign of fire anywhere else. No soot, no scorch marks on the walls. Just that melted toy sitting in the dust like it had been placed there. The police wrote the whole thing off as a runaway case when no bodies turned up, but no one in town believed that. Their wallets, bikes, and even shoes had been left behind. Parents don't forget details like that, and neither do small towns. That's why, even decades later, the mystery of those 3 kids, and that melted recording toy, still lingers like a shadow over the summer of 1996. For years the disappearance of Mark, Lisa, and Darren sat at the bottom of the sheriff's cold case files. The evidence box was rarely touched, stored away in a dusty back room filled with other unsolved tragedies. Inside that cardboard box were only a handful of items, fragments of burned clothing, a cracked flashlight, a few Polaroid photos of the farmhouse basement, and the melted recording toy. To most investigators who looked at it over the years, the toy seemed worthless. Just a cheap piece of plastic warped from heat. It never worked again, and no one thought twice about it. But as the decades passed, the story of the missing kids turned into something almost urban legend. Parents warned their children never to step near that farmhouse. Teenagers dared each other to, but none stayed long enough to prove they were brave. The case file sat untouched, gathering dust, until the county received funding in 2024 for a new cold case review unit. A young detective, eager to prove herself, volunteered to reopen the 1996 case. She requested the box, not knowing that what looked like trash inside it would be the key to uncovering something far darker than a simple disappearance. When the box was opened after nearly 30 years, the contents were unsettling. The melted toy still smelled faintly of burnt plastic, as though the fire that had touched it had never really gone out. The detective noticed something odd immediately. The battery compartment had corroded, but it wasn't empty. Someone had left the original batteries inside. And despite the decades, the toy seemed to hum faintly, as if something inside it was waiting. That discovery alone made her stop. Electronics don't just hum after 28 years. She carefully pried the compartment open, sliding the old batteries out. Against every procedure, and against her own better judgment, she placed 2 fresh batteries inside. The other officers joked about it. "That thing's fried. You're wasting your time." But when the toy gave a short mechanical click and a red light blinked for the first time since 1996, the room fell silent. For a few moments it only spat static, hissing, broken sounds, as though it was stuck between frequencies. And then, just faintly, something began to bleed through. It wasn't music, it wasn't garbled nonsense, it was a voice. A boy's voice, strained, shaky, terrified. The kind of voice you don't forget once you've heard it. The young detective's stomach dropped. Everyone in that evidence room realized what they were listening to. It wasn't just a melted toy. It was the last recording of a kid who had never come home. At first, the sound coming from the toy was nothing more than garbled static. Like an old radio stuck between stations. The sheriff's department staff exchanged uneasy glances, some even laughing nervously, but no one dared to turn it off. The static dragged on for almost a full minute before shifting. Beneath the crackling noise, something else began to take shape. A breath, a faint rustling. Then, unmistakably, a human voice, young, trembling, and barely audible, cut through the distortion. The officers leaned closer as the toy struggled to push out the sound, warping and stuttering like it was caught in time. Hello, Lisa. A mark, the voice whispered. The room froze. It wasn't a random phrase. It was as though the toy had captured a moment, words spoken in desperation, preserved inside a melted shell for nearly 3 decades. Someone swore under their breath. Others stepped back, the hair on their arms standing straight up. Then the voice shifted. Louder this time. More frantic. They're here, the boy said, his tone breaking with panic. The toy glitched, repeating the words again and again, each time in a more distorted pitch. They're here. They're here. They're here. The detective scrambled for her phone, trying to record the playback, but the toy wasn't responding to any controls. It wasn't playing a file in the normal sense. It was almost as if it was reliving it. The static returned, harsh and violent, but just as the sheriff reached out to shut it off, the voice cut through one final time. Don't follow the light. It isn't the sun. It's their eyes. Then came a sound that none of them could later explain. Not human, not mechanical. It was shrill, high-pitched, like an animal screaming underwater. The light on the toy blinked furiously, then snapped off, leaving the room in silence so heavy it felt suffocating. For a long time no one moved. The younger detective's hands were trembling as she finally set the toy down on the table. The old sheriff, pale as a ghost, muttered that he'd been in this department for 35 years and never heard anything like it. They all agreed on one thing, though, that recording wasn't a prank, and it wasn't some trick of faulty wires. It was the voice of Darren, one of the missing kids. And whatever he'd seen that night in 1996, he hadn't been alone. When the toy powered back on, it didn't start with static this time. Instead, it jumped straight into a voice, clearer than before, but cracked with fear. It's so dark, I can't see them anymore, but I know they're here. The words were strained, as though spoken through tears, and they sent a ripple of unease across the evidence room. Everyone listening leaned in, straining to hear what would come next. It didn't sound like a random fragment. It sounded like a diary entry, a final message pressed into plastic and wires by pure terror. The voice cracked again, louder now. Don't follow the light. There was a pause, followed by the sound of shuffling, like someone moving frantically across dirt or gravel. The officers could hear heavy breathing, and in the background, something else. A low humming noise, rhythmic and unnatural, like machinery mixed with a pulse. The detective wrote it down in her notes, but deep down, she knew no description could capture how wrong it felt to hear that sound. Then came the sentence that silenced the room. It isn't the sun, it's their eyes. His voice dropped on the last word, strangled, as if he had been cut off. One officer cursed under his breath and turned away, muttering that he didn't want to hear any more. But the toy wasn't done. As though feeding off the fear in the room, it emitted another sound, something shrill, piercing, and almost alive. It didn't resemble a voice at all. It was something primal, alien, and furious, as though the toy itself was screaming. The sound continued for almost 30 seconds, making everyone cover their ears. One of the fluorescent lights in the evidence room flickered violently, buzzing in sync with the unholy shriek. Just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The toy's light went out again, leaving only the echo of that horrible noise bouncing in the minds of everyone who heard it. Some officers swore it wasn't a sound coming from the toy. It was a sound being channeled through it, like a radio picking up a frequency that was never meant for human ears. When the silence finally settled, no one dared to move for several long moments. The youngest detective was shaking, clutching her pen so tightly it nearly snapped. The sheriff broke the silence first, saying what everyone else was too afraid to admit: that wasn't a recording. That was a warning. And just like that, the room realized that whatever those kids had faced back in 1996, it hadn't been human, and it wasn't finished. The decision to return to the farmhouse wasn't made lightly. The place had been boarded up for years, left to rot on the edge of town like a scar that nobody wanted to acknowledge. By the time the cold case team pulled up, the building was more skeleton than structure, collapsed roof beams, vines choking the walls, and windows that gaped like hollow eyes. The sheriff, now much older than when the teens first vanished, stood at the doorway with a grim look, muttering that some things were better left sealed. But the younger detective insisted. If the recording was real, the basement might still hold the answers. Inside, the air was damp and suffocating, thick with the smell of mold and decay. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing graffiti scrawled across the peeling wallpaper. Names, symbols, and crude warnings like, "Don't go downstairs," sprayed in red. The floorboards groaned with every step as though the house itself resented their presence. Still, the group pressed forward, eventually finding the door to the basement. It was warped, swollen from moisture, and the hinges screeched like an animal in pain as they forced it open. The basement looked almost exactly as it had in the old police photos. Concrete floor cracked in places, stone walls sweating with moisture, and a staircase that leaned as though it might collapse at any second. But what the team hadn't seen before was the new damage. Deep grooves carved into the concrete, running in strange, looping patterns like claw marks. The younger detective crouched to examine them, her hand trembling as she traced the jagged edges. Whatever had made those marks had gouged straight through stone. They brought in equipment to drill into the cracked floor, suspecting that something had been buried beneath. The sound of the drill echoed harshly through the basement, each vibration making the air feel heavier. After a few minutes, the drill bit hit something different. A hollow thud beneath the concrete. When they pried the broken slabs apart, they found a small pit filled with charred fragments, melted cassette tapes, scraps of burnt clothing, and what looked like shoes fused into lumps of ash and rubber. Among the debris were more claw-like scratches, this time scorched into the underside of the stone itself, as though whatever had been trapped below had tried to tear its way out. The team gathered the evidence in silence, each item more disturbing than the last, but none of it explained the most unsettling discovery: a faint handprint, burned into the concrete wall near the pit. Small, delicate, clearly belonging to a teenager. The print was charred black, as though pressed there with impossible heat, and yet the wall around it was untouched. The sheriff stared at it for a long time before whispering under his breath, "They weren't buried here, they were pulled here." Word spread quickly after the evidence team broke into the farmhouse basement. The town had kept its silence for nearly 3 decades, but the strange discovery stirred up something buried just as deep as that concrete pit. Old memories, rumors, and whispered warnings that most folks had pretended to forget. At first, only a handful of elderly residents came forward. They spoke cautiously, like people afraid their words might be overheard. They claimed the land had been wrong long before the farmhouse was ever built, and the teens in '96 weren't the first to vanish near it. Digging through county records, the younger detective uncovered stories that stretched back to the late 1800s. Families who'd settled the farmland reported strange lights moving across their fields at night. Bright orbs that hovered low, too deliberate to be lanterns and too silent to be machines. Travelers spoke of being followed by shadows that never matched their steps. Some swore they heard voices calling their names in the cornfields, though no one was there. The reports always ended the same, with missing livestock, missing pets, and in a few cases, missing people. By the 1920s, the stories had become so frequent that locals stopped building near the property altogether. The farmhouse itself had been abandoned more than once, each family leaving faster than the one before. Old church records showed warnings about false sons and lights that lead astray, written in shaky ink by preachers who begged their congregations never to cross the fields after dark. Some called it superstition, others said it was a curse. But no one could deny that the disappearances always centered around the same patch of land. As the detective dug deeper, more unsettling details emerged. A retired deputy admitted, in hushed tones, that in 1978 2 hunters had gone missing near the same farmhouse. Their rifles were found propped neatly against the barn, but the men themselves were never recovered. The deputy swore he saw lights that night, 3 of them, hovering low and pulsing like eyes watching from the tree line. He'd tried to report it, but his captain shut him down, saying it would ruin the town. The more the cold case team uncovered, the more the townspeople's silence began to make sense. This wasn't just an isolated tragedy from 1996, it was part of a pattern stretching back over a century. And if the recording toy really had captured what Darren saw that night, then maybe the legends weren't legends at all. Maybe the kids had stumbled onto something that the town had been too afraid to face, generation after generation. Something that was still waiting in the fields, watching with its burning eyes. For nearly 28 years, the families of the missing kids lived in torment, stuck between grief and uncertainty. Most of them eventually moved out of the town, unable to pass the farmhouse without feeling sick. But one mother, Lisa's mom, refused to leave. She stayed in the same small house on the edge of town, keeping her daughter's room exactly as it had been in 1996, posters still on the wall, clothes still folded in drawers, and the same teddy bear sitting on her bed. Every year, on the anniversary of the disappearance, she lit a candle in the window, hoping her daughter might somehow find her way home. It was on the 28th anniversary in the summer of 2024 that the strange call came. At first, it was nothing but static on the answering machine. Then, faintly, a voice bled through, young, trembling, and heartbreakingly familiar. "Mom, what, can you hear me?" The woman dropped the phone when she realized it was Lisa's voice. Not older, not changed by time, but exactly as it had sounded in 1996, preserved like it had been frozen in place. The message went on for only a few seconds, but every word carved itself into her memory. "I'm still here, it's so dark. Please don't let them take you too." After that, the static surged, violent and loud, until the call abruptly cut off. The caller ID showed no number, just a blank screen, as though the call had never existed. When the sheriff's department traced the line, they found nothing. No record, no signal. It was as if the message had come from nowhere. Terrified but desperate, Lisa's mother brought the recording to the cold case team. They played it side by side with the voice from the melted toy, and the room fell silent. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. Same tone, same pitch, same frightened stammer. The voice from 1996 had somehow bled into 2024. One officer suggested it might be a cruel prank, but no one could explain how anyone could replicate the exact warped sound of a toy recorder that had melted nearly 3 decades ago. The mother swore the voice was her daughter's. The team couldn't deny it anymore. Whatever had happened in that farmhouse basement hadn't ended with the disappearance. The voice was reaching out across decades, clawing its way through damaged toys and dead phone lines, trying to be heard. And if Lisa's warning was true, then it wasn't just about what happened back in 1996. It was about what was still coming. So here we are, 28 years later, and the mystery of that summer night in 1996 remains unsolved. 3 teenagers entered that farmhouse and never walked out. A melted toy whispered their final moments, a burned basement revealed impossible scars, and a mother's phone carried a voice that should no longer exist. Some people say the kids are still out there, trapped between worlds, trying to warn us. Others believe the land itself is cursed, a place where time folds in on itself and voices never really fade. But one thing is certain: if Lisa's message was real, then whatever took them never left. So the next time you're driving late at night and see a strange light glowing in the distance, ask yourself, is it really the sunrise? Or is it something watching, waiting, just like it was back in 1996? Because sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Most importantly, subscribe and hit the bell icon so the next secret finds you first.